I came home early that day, expecting nothing more than silence and rest. Instead, I heard words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family. In a single moment, trust had turned into betrayal, love into something unrecognizable, and the life I had built began to crumble from the inside. What hurt the most was not just the deception, but the realization that it had been happening right in front of me all along, and I had chosen not to see it. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I am Eleanor Hayes, and at 67 years old, I have learned that the things we believe are permanent often turn out to be the most fragile. For most of my life, I thought I had built something that could not be shaken. My home in Charleston, South Carolina, stood as a symbol of that belief. It was a large coastal estate with wide porches, tall white columns, and windows that opened to the endless blue of the Atlantic Ocean. Every brick, every piece of furniture, every carefully planted rose bush represented years of sacrifice, long nights, and decisions that carried more risk than comfort. I was not born into wealth or opportunity. After my husband died from a sudden heart condition, I was left alone with a young son and a future that felt uncertain and unforgiving. I still remember the weight of those early years, when every bill mattered and every choice could change the course of our lives. I built my real estate business slowly, one property at a time, negotiating deals during the day and reviewing contracts late into the night. I did not allow myself the luxury of failure because my son depended on me for everything. Daniel grew up watching that determination. He was a quiet child, observant and kind, but there was always a strength in him that reminded me of his father. As he grew older, that strength turned into courage. He chose to become a firefighter, a decision that filled me with both pride and fear. The day he graduated from the academy, standing tall in his uniform, I felt something inside me settle. I believed I had done enough. I believed he would have a life defined by purpose and dignity. That belief lasted until the day everything changed. 3 years ago, a warehouse fire on the outskirts of Charleston collapsed while Daniel was inside. He managed to carry a child to safety before the structure gave way, but the falling debris crushed his lower spine. The doctors told me he was fortunate to survive. I nodded when they said it, but the word fortunate felt hollow. Survival came with a cost neither of us had been prepared to pay. Daniel would never walk again. When he returned home, I made sure the house was ready for him. I had ramps installed at every entrance, widened the hallways, and converted my study into a fully accessible bedroom. I told myself that if life had taken something from him, then I would replace it with whatever comfort and stability I could provide. I learned new routines, adjusted to new limitations, and tried to create a sense of normalcy in a life that no longer resembled the one we had known. Vanessa came into our lives not long before the accident. She was a corporate attorney, polished and confident, with a way of speaking that commanded attention without effort. When Daniel introduced her to me, I saw hope return to his eyes in a way that eased something deep inside my chest. After the accident, that hope seemed to grow stronger through her presence. She attended his therapy sessions, managed his medications, and gradually took on responsibilities that I had carried alone for years. I trusted her. More than that, I depended on her. At the time, It felt like a blessing to have someone step in when I was too tired to keep holding everything together on my own. I believed we were healing as a family, rebuilding something stable from the ruins of what had been lost. What I did not see then was how quietly control can shift when trust is given without question. And by the time I began to understand that, it would already be too late. If you are still watching and feel the weight of everything building beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now, let's move on to what I was never meant to hear. That afternoon began like any other, ordinary and predictable in the way I had come to rely on. A meeting I had scheduled with a property manager was canceled at the last minute, and for once, I allowed myself to feel relieved instead of inconvenienced. I decided to head home early, thinking I might sit on the porch with a cup of tea and enjoy the quiet rhythm of the ocean. It had been a long time since I had allowed myself a moment that was not filled with responsibility. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off, though I could not immediately explain why. The house stood exactly as it always had, elegant and still, but there was a silence to it that felt heavier than usual. I told myself I was imagining things. After everything we had been through, I had grown used to searching for problems where there were none. I entered through the front door as quietly as I could, slipping off my shoes and setting my bag down without making a sound. I did not want to disturb Daniel if he was resting. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. For a moment, everything looked peaceful, almost untouched by the struggles that had defined our lives over the past few years. Then I heard her voice. It came from the living room, sharp and unfamiliar, in a way that made me stop mid-step. It was Vanessa, but not the Vanessa I thought I knew. There was no warmth in her tone, no softness. Instead, there was something cold, something edged with a kind of disdain I had never heard before. I should have walked away. I should have made my presence known. But something held me in place, something instinctive that told me to stay still and listen. "Your mother is nothing but a burden," she said. The words struck me with such force that I felt my breath catch in my throat. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed lightly against the wall for support. For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood, if I had somehow twisted her meaning in my mind, but there was no mistaking what came next. She spoke about the house, about the business, about everything I had built as if it were already hers. She spoke about Daniel in a way that made my chest tighten, describing him not as my son, but as an obstacle, a problem to be managed until he was no longer useful. I could not see Daniel from where I stood, but I could hear him. His voice was low, controlled, carrying a weight that I had not noticed before. He did not argue with her. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with a quiet resignation that broke something inside me. And then she said something that changed everything. The child she was carrying was not his. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. That child had been our hope, a fragile promise of something new, something good. I had allowed myself to believe in it, to imagine a future that included laughter and second chances. And now, in a matter of seconds, that future dissolved into something unrecognizable. What hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself was the realization that Daniel already knew. There was no surprise in his voice, no disbelief, only a tired acceptance, as if he had been carrying this truth alone for far longer than I could have imagined. I felt something inside me shift then, something quiet but undeniable. The grief was still there, the shock, the anger, but beneath all of it, something steadier began to take shape. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound, retreating down the hallway the same way I had come. My heart was still racing, but my thoughts had begun to sharpen. Whatever illusion I had been living in was gone now, replaced by a clarity that left no room for denial. In that moment, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer safe in my own home. If you are still here and starting to sense something is not right, comment number 2 below so I know you are paying attention. Now, let's uncover the first crack in the truth. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word I had heard in the hallway. By morning, something inside me had changed. The shock was still there, sharp and heavy, but it no longer controlled me. I had spent too many years building my life to let it be dismantled without understanding how it was happening. If Vanessa thought I was unaware, then that would be my advantage. So I said nothing. I moved through the next day as if everything were normal. I prepared breakfast, checked on Daniel, and exchanged polite conversation with Vanessa. I even thanked her for handling the medications the night before. She smiled, the same composed expression I had trusted for years, and for the first time I saw it for what it might be. Not kindness, but performance. From that moment on, I began to watch. It started with small things. The way Vanessa and Marcus avoided looking at each other directly when I was in the room, as if they were careful not to reveal too much. The way their conversations would stop the moment I entered. The timing of their movements, always slightly too coordinated to be coincidence. I had spent decades negotiating deals and reading people. Patterns reveal themselves when you are patient enough to notice them. Marcus, in particular, began to draw my attention. He had been introduced as a specialist in physical rehabilitation, someone with experience in spinal injuries. At the time, I had accepted that without question. Now, I listened more closely. When he spoke about Daniel's condition, his explanations were vague, lacking the detail I would expect from someone with real expertise. When I asked specific questions, he redirected or simplified his answers in a way that felt rehearsed. That was when I decided to verify who he really was. I reached out quietly to an old business contact who had experience conducting background checks. I did not provide many details, only a name and a request for discretion. Within 2 days, I had my answer. There was no record of Marcus holding any valid medical license, no certifications, no employment history in rehabilitation facilities. The man living in my house under the pretense of helping my son was not who he claimed to be. That discovery alone would have been enough to raise alarm, but it was only the beginning. I turned my attention to Daniel's finances. Over the years, I had structured his accounts carefully, ensuring that his future would be secure regardless of what happened to me. When I accessed the records, I noticed changes I did not remember authorizing. Vanessa's name had been added as a joint controller on several accounts, including his investment portfolio. The permissions granted were extensive, far beyond what would be necessary for simple assistance. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reviewing the documents. That was when I noticed the signatures. Several forms had been signed by Daniel in recent months, approving financial adjustments and granting authority. At first glance, they appeared legitimate, but when I looked closer, I saw subtle inconsistencies. The handwriting was his, but uneven, as if written under strain or fatigue. And then I remembered. There had been days when Daniel returned from therapy exhausted, heavily medicated for pain. Vanessa would sit beside him with papers, guiding his hand, assuring him it was routine. I had seen it happen more than once, and I had not questioned it. I trusted her. Now, that trust felt like a mistake I could not undo. I began to connect the pieces, the false credentials, the financial access, the manipulated signatures. This was not impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated over time, designed to unfold without drawing attention. I was not dealing with a moment of betrayal. I was facing a plan. The realization settled over me with a clarity that left no room for denial. This was only the first crack in something much larger. If you are still watching and beginning to see how deep this goes, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's step into the moment everything starts to unravel. By the time the truth began to settle into something solid and undeniable, I understood that reacting too quickly would be my greatest mistake. Whatever Vanessa and Marcus were planning had not been built overnight. It had taken time, patience, and a careful understanding of our vulnerabilities. If I wanted to protect what was mine, I would have to be just as deliberate. So I chose silence. The following days unfolded in a strange imitation of normal life. I moved through the house as I always had, preparing meals, checking on Daniel, and engaging in polite, measured conversations with Vanessa. I thanked her for her help, complimented her attention to detail, and allowed her to believe that nothing had changed. Inside, however, every word I spoke was calculated, every gesture controlled. I was no longer living in my home. I was studying it. I arranged to meet with my attorney under the pretense of updating my estate documents. He had worked with me for more than 2 decades and understood my instincts without requiring full explanation. In his office, behind closed doors, I outlined what I had discovered. I spoke carefully, presenting facts rather than emotions, aware that what I needed now was strategy, not sympathy. He listened without interruption, his expression tightening as I described the financial changes and the questionable signatures. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together, considering the situation with the same caution I had come to trust in him. What he told me confirmed my fears. If Vanessa had obtained those signatures while Daniel appeared mentally competent, even if he was under the influence of medication, challenging those documents would not be simple. Without clear evidence of manipulation or coercion, the law could recognize her authority as legitimate. In other words, if I acted too soon, I could lose everything I had spent a lifetime building. I left his office with a new understanding of the stakes. This was not just about betrayal, it was about control, and control, once lost, would not be easily reclaimed. That same afternoon, I hired a private investigator. I did not take the decision lightly, but I knew I needed proof that went beyond suspicion. I asked him to follow Vanessa and Marcus, to document their movements, their meetings, and any financial connections that could establish intent. He agreed without hesitation, and within days, he began sending me preliminary updates. At home, the balance of power continued to shift. Vanessa moved through the house with increasing confidence, making decisions without consulting me, adjusting Daniel's schedule, even speaking on his behalf when others called. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable once I allowed myself to see it clearly. I was being pushed aside, not through confrontation, but through quiet replacement. Daniel noticed it too. He said little, but I could see it in the way his eyes followed her, and the tension that settled into his shoulders when she spoke for him. There were moments when our eyes met across the room, and in that silence, we understood each other. He was not ready to confront her, but he was no longer blind. The investigators' reports began to fill in the gaps. Vanessa and Marcus met frequently outside the house, often in places that had nothing to do with Daniel's care. There were financial transactions that suggested coordination, not coincidence. Each new detail confirmed what I already knew. Time was no longer on my side. I began reviewing my own assets, considering how to protect them without drawing attention. Any sudden change could alert Vanessa, and if she realized I knew the truth, whatever she was planning might accelerate beyond my control. For now, I remained still. But beneath that stillness, everything was shifting. The silence I had chosen was not peace. It was the quiet before the storm. If you are still here and feeling the tension rise, comment number 4 below so I know you are ready for what is coming next. Now, let's move into the truth becoming dangerous. By the time the full report arrived, I was no longer hoping to be wrong. There was a strange clarity in knowing that whatever I had suspected was now confirmed. Doubt had been replaced by certainty, and with that certainty came something far more unsettling. This was not simply betrayal. It was something far more deliberate, far more dangerous. The investigator called me early that morning, his voice measured, almost cautious, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to say. I listened in silence as he outlined Marcus's history: fraud, identity deception, financial manipulation. He had targeted vulnerable individuals before, often inserting himself into their lives under the guise of trust. Each case followed a similar pattern: gain access, build dependence, extract value, disappear. I stood by the window as I listened, watching the ocean stretch endlessly beyond the horizon, but seeing none of it. Then came the part that mattered most. Vanessa was not one of his victims. There was evidence that she had known about his past long before he entered our home. Communication records, financial links, shared accounts. She had not been deceived. She had chosen to participate. The woman I had welcomed into my family, the woman I had trusted with my son's care, had made a conscious decision to align herself with someone like him. For a moment, I closed my eyes. The pain was still there, sharp and immediate, but it no longer overwhelmed me. It settled into something steadier, something colder. I was not just hurt. I was being threatened. That understanding changed everything. Later that afternoon, I reviewed documents the investigator had forwarded. Among them was something I had not expected to find: a life insurance policy. It had been taken out on Daniel only months earlier, after his accident. The coverage amount was substantial, far beyond what would be considered routine, and the primary beneficiary was Vanessa. I read the document twice, then a third time, each word sharpening the unease already forming in my chest. This was not about securing a future. This was about creating an outcome. Memories began to surface with uncomfortable clarity. The way Vanessa insisted on managing Daniel's medications, the days when he seemed unusually fatigued, his responses slower, his awareness dulled. At the time, I had attributed it to pain, to recovery, to the natural exhaustion that came with his condition. Now, I questioned everything. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rather than react. Fear would not help me. Panic would only make me careless. And carelessness, in a situation like this, could cost more than money. It could cost Daniel. The pieces fit together too cleanly to ignore. The false credentials, the financial control, the manipulated signatures, and now the insurance policy. This was not a scattered set of bad decisions. It was a structured plan, built with patience and intention. And if it was a plan, then it had a timeline. I no longer had the luxury of waiting. Standing there, holding those documents, I felt something inside me shift again. It was no longer about uncovering the truth. That part was done. What remained was deciding how to respond to it. For most of my life, I had been a builder. I created, protected, and provided. But now, I understood that those instincts alone would not be enough. I would have to think differently. I would have to anticipate, to move ahead of whatever came next. Because whatever Vanessa and Marcus had planned, it was already in motion. And if I hesitated, even for a moment, I could lose more than everything I had built. I could lose my son. In that moment, one truth settled in with absolute certainty. Silence was no longer protection. It was a risk I could not afford. Once the truth revealed itself in full, there was no comfort left in hesitation. Every instinct I had as a mother told me to act immediately, to remove Daniel from the house, to confront Vanessa and force an end to whatever she and Marcus had set in motion. But instinct alone could not protect us. I had seen enough to understand that this situation required more than emotion. It required precision. I spent that night weighing the only two choices that remained. I could go to the police with what I had, present the evidence, and hope it would be enough to stop them. Or I could wait, gather more, and build something stronger, something that would leave no room for doubt. The first option offered speed, but carried risk. The second required patience, but it gave me control. By morning, I had made my decision. I would not confront them. Instead, I would let them believe they had already won. The shift in my behavior had to be subtle, believable. I could not afford to overplay it. I began by stepping back from decisions I had always managed myself. When Vanessa offered to handle certain documents or financial matters, I agreed without resistance. I allowed hesitation to enter my voice, let uncertainty shape my words. It was not entirely an act. There was truth in my exhaustion, in the weight I had carried for so long. But now, I used that truth to create something useful. Vanessa noticed. I saw it in the way she watched me, measuring, reassessing. At first there was caution, as if she suspected a change she could not fully define. Then slowly, that caution began to fade. Confidence replaced it. She spoke more freely, made decisions without seeking my input, and moved through the house with a growing sense of ownership. That was exactly what I needed. Behind that carefully maintained facade, I began documenting everything. I recorded conversations when I could, stored copies of financial documents, and tracked every transaction that passed through Daniel's accounts. I made sure that each piece of evidence was preserved in a way that could not be dismissed or challenged. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. Telling Daniel was the most difficult part. I chose my moment carefully, waiting until we were alone, away from any possibility of interruption. When I explained what I had discovered, I saw the truth settle over him in a way that words could not soften. There was no disbelief, only a quiet confirmation of something he had already begun to understand. The pain in his expression was immediate, but beneath it, something else emerged: resolve. He did not ask many questions. He did not need to. From that point forward, we moved as one. There was no need for long conversations or detailed explanations. A glance across the room was enough to communicate what could not be spoken. We understood the stakes, and more importantly, we understood each other. Meanwhile, the pressure within the house continued to build. Vanessa began to accelerate her efforts, bringing forward more documents, more decisions that required Daniel's approval. Marcus appeared more frequently, his presence less restrained, as if he no longer felt the need to maintain the illusion as carefully as before. Their confidence was growing, and with it, their urgency. They believed the outcome was inevitable. That belief was their weakness. Every day became a performance, every interaction a calculated move. I lived two lives within the same walls. To Vanessa, I was a tired woman ready to relinquish control. To myself, I was something else entirely. I was preparing for the moment when everything would change. And once that moment arrived, there would be no way back. If you are still watching and realize there is no turning back now, comment number 6 below to let me know you are with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7, where everything collapses. By the time the final pieces of my plan were in place, I no longer felt the weight of uncertainty that had followed me for weeks. What remained was something steadier, almost detached. I had done everything I could to prepare, to protect, to anticipate. Now, all that was left was to act. The morning we left Charleston began quietly. Vanessa had already gone out of town the night before, claiming she had a legal matter that required her attention. I had encouraged it, masking my relief behind polite understanding. Marcus was not in the house either. His absence had become more frequent in recent days, a sign of the confidence they both believed they had secured. They no longer felt the need to maintain appearances as carefully. That confidence was exactly what allowed us to leave without resistance. I moved through the house one last time, each step deliberate, each glance carrying more memory than I expected. The walls, the furniture, the spaces I had shaped over decades, all stood exactly as they had the day before. But something fundamental had already changed. This was no longer my home. It had not been for some time. Daniel waited near the front entrance, his expression calm, though I could see the tension beneath it. We did not speak much. There was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. Everything important had been decided long before this moment. We took only what we needed. Documents, essentials, a few personal items that could not be replaced. The rest remained behind, part of a life we were no longer willing to defend. As I closed the door for the final time, I felt a sharp pull in my chest, not regret, but recognition. I was leaving behind more than a house. I was leaving behind the illusion that had once made it feel safe. On the table in the living room, I left an envelope. Inside was a letter, written with care and clarity, outlined everything we knew: the deception, the manipulation, the financial control. I made it clear that every asset had been secured, every account protected, every legal vulnerability closed. There would be no opportunity left for them to exploit. At the end, I added a single line, not out of anger, but out of finality. There would be no further contact. We did not look back as we drove away. Hours later, in the quiet of our new location, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen when Vanessa returned. I did not need to see it to understand it. The empty house. The silence where there should have been control. The moment when she would realize that everything had been taken from her before she even knew she was losing it. I knew she would find the letter. I knew she would read it more than once, searching for a weakness that no longer existed, and I knew the realization would come slowly, then all at once. There would be anger first, sharp and immediate, then disbelief, and finally, panic. Marcus would not stay. Men like him never did when the situation turned against them. I could already picture the fracture between them, the blame shifting, the trust collapsing as quickly as it had once formed. If there had ever been any loyalty between them, it would not survive the loss of control. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Not satisfaction, not victory. Those emotions belonged to a different kind of person. What I felt was the absence of pressure, the quiet realization that the threat we had been living under was no longer immediate. The cost of that freedom, however, was not something I could ignore. I had lost a home, a sense of trust, and the version of my family I had once believed in. But as I looked at Daniel, sitting beside me, steady and present in a way he had not been for months, I understood what we had gained. They believed they were taking everything from us. They never realized we had already taken back what mattered most. The first thing I noticed about Sedona was the silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence I had felt in Charleston during those final weeks, when every quiet moment seemed filled with tension and unspoken truths. This silence was different. It stretched wide across the red desert landscape, carried by warm air and open sky. It did not press against me. It allowed me space. The house we moved into was modest compared to what we had left behind, but it felt honest. There were no grand hallways or polished floors, no reminders of expectations or past victories. Just clean lines, wide windows, and a view of distant mountains that changed color with the light. For the first time in years, I woke up without immediately thinking about what needed to be controlled or protected. At first, the absence of pressure felt unfamiliar. I found myself pausing in the middle of simple tasks, unsure of what came next. For so long, my life had been defined by responsibility and vigilance that I did not know how to exist without them. The quiet that surrounded us was not uncomfortable, but it exposed a kind of emptiness I had not expected. Daniel adjusted more quickly. Within days, I began to notice subtle changes in him. His posture, even in the chair, seemed more relaxed. The tension that had once settled into his shoulders had eased. He spoke more freely, not out of obligation, but with genuine interest. There was a lightness in him that had been missing for months, perhaps longer. I realized then how much of his weight had not come from his condition, but from everything surrounding it. Our days became simple. We ate meals together without interruption, spent time outside in the early mornings, and allowed conversations to happen without urgency. There were no schedules imposed by someone else, no quiet monitoring of our choices. It was a different kind of life, one I had not imagined for us, but one that began to feel natural. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while running errands, we encountered a family at a small clinic on the edge of town. Their young son had suffered a severe spinal injury, and they were struggling to cover the cost of his treatment. I watched the mother as she spoke with the staff, her voice steady but strained, and something inside me tightened. I recognized that expression. It was the same mixture of fear and determination I had carried years ago, when everything in my life had felt uncertain and beyond my control. I did not need to hear her entire story to understand it. I had lived it. Daniel saw it too. Later that evening, as we sat outside watching the sky darken over the desert, he spoke in a way I had not heard in a long time. He did not dwell on what he had lost. Instead, he spoke about what could still be done. He wanted to help, not in a distant or symbolic way, but in something real, something structured. A foundation, he said, that could support families facing the same kind of challenges we had endured. Financial assistance, resources, guidance. A way to turn what had happened to him into something that mattered beyond our own lives. I listened, surprised at first, then slowly understanding. This was not just an idea, it was a direction. For the first time since we left Charleston, I felt something shift again, not out of fear, but out of possibility. We were no longer reacting to what had been done to us. We were choosing what came next. For the first time in a long while, we were not just surviving. We were beginning to live again. If you are still here and feeling the shift towards something new, comment number 8 below, so I know you are ready for the ending. Now let's move into the final outcome of the story. By the time the desert heat softened into the early hints of autumn, our lives in Sedona had settled into something steady and purposeful. The chaos we had left behind in Charleston no longer followed us in the same way. It lingered at the edges of memory, but it no longer defined our days. The foundation began as a simple idea, spoken quietly under an open sky, but it quickly grew into something far more real. I drew on the same instincts that had guided me through years of building my business: structure, clarity, and patience, legal filings, financial planning, partnerships. Each step required attention, but unlike the life I had left behind, this work felt different. It was not driven by survival. It was driven by intention. Daniel became the heart of it. I watched him take on a role I had not seen in years. He spoke with purpose, connected with families, and listened in a way that made people feel understood. His condition had not changed, but the way he carried it had. He was no longer defined by what he had lost. Instead, he had begun to shape something meaningful from it. The first families we helped did not know our story in full, and they did not need to. What mattered was that they were no longer facing their struggles alone. I saw the relief in their expressions, the quiet gratitude that could not always be put into words. In those moments, something inside me began to heal in a way I had not expected. Then, one afternoon, I received an envelope. There was no return address, but I knew where it had come from before I even opened it. Inside was a check, substantial enough to fund months of work for the foundation. There was no long explanation, no attempt to justify what had been done. Just a brief note, written in a hand I recognized. It spoke of regret, of acknowledgement, and of a desire to make something right, even if it could never be undone. I sat with that letter for a long time. I expected anger to return, or perhaps the familiar weight of disappointment, but neither came. What I felt instead was something quieter, distance. Whatever connection I had once believed in was gone, replaced by a clarity that left no room for confusion. When I showed the check to Daniel, he was silent for a moment. I could see the conflict in his expression, the memory of what had been mixed with the reality of what remained. In the end, his decision was simple. We would use it. Not for ourselves, but for the work we had chosen to do. If that money could be turned into something that helped others, then it would no longer belong to the past that had created it. That choice felt like a closing. Not forgiveness in the way people often describe it, and not reconciliation. Just an understanding that holding on to what had been done would not change anything. Letting go, however, allowed us to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. As I looked at what we had built, at the lives we had begun to touch, I realized something I had not understood before. We did not recover what we had lost. We became something stronger because of it. There are mornings now when I sit on the small terrace behind our home in Sedona, watching the sunlight move slowly across the red rocks, and I allow myself to be still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from exhaustion or fear, but one that feels earned. The air is quiet, open, and honest, much like the life we have built here. When I think back to the woman I was not long ago, I see someone who believed that love and loyalty were enough to hold a family together. I believed that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, trusted deeply enough, everything would remain intact. I did not understand then that trust, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a doorway instead of a foundation. The day I stood in that hallway and heard those words changed something in me that cannot be undone. It was not just the betrayal. It was the realization that I had mistaken appearances for truth. That moment stripped away the comfort of illusion and forced me to see my life as it truly was. But it did not destroy me. If anything, it revealed a strength I had not needed to use before. I became more aware, more deliberate, more willing to protect what mattered without apology. And in doing so, I found a version of myself that was not defined by what I had lost, but by what I chose to preserve. I see that same change in Daniel. He is not the man he was before the accident, but he is not less. He is different in ways that carry more weight than anything he has lost. There is purpose in him now, a quiet determination that shapes everything he does. Watching him has taught me that survival is not the end of a story. It is only the beginning of a new one. As for the past, I no longer carry it the way I once did. There is no anger left in me, no need to revisit what cannot be changed. What happened was real, and it mattered, but it does not define what comes next. Some things are meant to be left where they ended. That day, I believed I was losing everything. I understand now that I was only losing what was never truly mine. I did not lose my life that day. I found the truth of it. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters. What once felt like loss can become a doorway to something deeper, something more honest than the version of life we once believed in. Trust may break, and the ground beneath us may shift without warning. But within those moments lies a choice. We can hold on to what hurt us, or we can allow it to reshape us into something stronger, wiser, and more aware. Not every ending is meant to be repaired. Some are meant to be understood, accepted, and released. And sometimes, what we thought was taken from us was never truly ours to begin with. What remains, after everything falls away, is who we choose to become. Thank you for being here. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.